Hey everybody, Fundamental P here, and this is part two of, I don't know if we could call it I guess we could call it the fundamentals of music. And remember, fun, right? F-U-N. We're trying to have fun here as we explore some of these musical concepts. I think that, like I said in the last video, I was just thinking this would be cool stuff for people to know about, and I guess as we continue through the videos, maybe I would expect fewer and fewer people to know about some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today and maybe tomorrow and the next video I make. But nonetheless, here we go. So what we talked about last time were the notes on the keyboard. We looked first at the white notes on the keyboard, and then we looked at the black notes on the keyboard, and finally we looked at the chromatic scale, really, and we started here with C, and then we moved up to C sharp, and then D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, and then we ended where we started on C, and we decided that this was an octave. Okay, this is a C that we ended on, and this is a C here that we started on. Those notes sound similar, but they're different notes, right? So it turns out they're both C notes, but one is an octave higher than the other, and this one's an octave lower than the last note we played. So that's where we that's kind of where we ended up at the end of the last video, and we actually descended, right? We moved down the keyboard from the right to the left. And we named the black notes a little differently. So when we did this, we started with C, B, B flat, A flat, G, G flat, F, E, E flat, D, D flat, and C. Okay, so one of the things we talked about in the last video is that this black note here, which is C sharp, relative to the note below it, which is C, it can also be called D flat, and that's sort of relative to the D that's sitting above it. So this would be D flat, okay, or C sharp, right? So we can name that note as either C sharp or D flat, and in different contexts, we may want to name that note differently. Speaking of naming notes differently, we're going to talk about some stuff today related to this chromatic scale, is what we discovered in that last video. And we're going to dig in a little bit deeper here, and we're going to talk about some things that I think are really cool. So one of the things I want you to understand that I didn't tell you in that last video, in that first video, is that when we move from any note on the keyboard to the note right above it or to the note right below it, we are moving a half step, okay? We're moving a half step. So if we move from C to C sharp, that's called a half step. That interval between C and C sharp is called a half step. Well, the interval between C sharp and D is also called a half step. Here's another half step between D and D sharp, half step between E sharp and E, and then we can continue this all the way up, right? Half step between E and F, half step between F and F sharp, between F sharp and G, between G and G sharp, between G sharp and A, between A and A sharp, between A sharp and B, and then another half step between B and C, right? So this is kind of cool. Half steps, okay? Another concept that, I don't know if it'll be super important today. It's definitely going to be important at some point, because I've got a lot of stuff in my head that I've been imagining wanting to share with all of you, sort of as I go throughout my day and I'm driving, or I'm just relaxing or going to sleep at night. There's things I go, oh, I want to talk to him about that. So the whole, another thing that's going to be really useful for us at some point is the concept of a whole step. And it turns out that 2 half steps is equivalent to a whole step. So notice there's a half step between C and C sharp. There's another half step between C sharp and D, and that means between C and D, that is not a half step, that's a whole step. Why? Because there was a half step between C and C sharp, another half step between C sharp and D, and if we add those 2 half steps, kind of mathematical, you end up with a whole step, okay? There's another whole step between D and E. Why? I don't know. One way of thinking of it is, well, there's a black note between these two notes. So here's D, here's E. If there's a black note in between them, then this must be a whole step, okay? Another way of thinking of it is, just like we did before, well, if there's a half step from D to D sharp, and there's a half step between D sharp and E, then there must be a whole step between D and E, okay? Now this is interesting. There is no, as we discovered last time, there is no black note between E and F, okay? There is no black note. In fact, this is a half step. There's a half step between E and F. Isn't that interesting? Okay, even though they're both white notes, okay? So the concepts of whole steps and half steps will be interesting and useful for us at some point, but one of the things I wanted to talk about today is these intervals, right? And you know, it's like when I told you that this note can be called C sharp or it can be called D flat. There's a lot of other stuff like that in music where we have these different ways of looking at things and different ways of naming things, all of which are legitimate, but it can be a little confusing because once you have one, you know, terminology down, all of a sudden you're, well, I thought that was called a C sharp. Well, it is, but it's also called a D flat, right? We're going to discover some other things like that today as we discuss some of these intervals. So I guess the first thing I want to talk about is, you know, we talked about the fact that this was a C and this was a C, but that they sound quite different, okay? Some people would describe this second C as being higher than the first C, yeah, right? This is a higher note than this note, even though they're both C's, okay? Like I've mentioned a couple times now, this second C is an octave higher than the lower C, and this lower C is an octave lower than the higher C. So, but they're both C notes, but they're not the same note. Now check this out, okay? I turned on both keyboards here today because... Now wait just a second. I'm going to do that again. Now those really are the same note, okay? Now the patch that they used on this older keyboard to resemble the sound of a piano is a little bit different than the patch they used for this keyboard, which is actually a little bit older than a little bit newer than this keyboard. They're both old keyboards, but they're actually great Yamaha keyboards that were given to me by a friend. But anyway, so this is a C. This is also a C. Okay? And even though the sort of the sound of that second note is slightly different than the first one, I want you to hear that those are the same note. Okay? Unlike these two notes that are an octave apart, these two notes are the same note. Okay? Those are the same note. And if we play those notes at the same time, we have something that's called perfect unison, okay? And that would be if we're playing the same note at the same time on two different instruments. On this case, they're both pianos, but let's see here. That's perfect unison. So one C is being played on the keyboard, another C is being sung by me, and if I sing that while I'm striking the key, I also get perfect unison, right? So we can do that either way here. So that's an interesting concept. Now, moving from there, check this out. So we play the same note at the same time, we get something called perfect unison. And that's actually an interval, okay? That's just like remember the octave I told you about before? Well, there's another name for that. It's called the perfect octave. So listen to this. Okay? What I had done before is I played this note first and then I played this note, and I told you those were an octave apart, but if I play those two notes together at the same time, I'm basically creating an interval that has a special name called a perfect octave. And one of the things that I wanted you to do today is just listen. Listen to what this sounds like, and if possible, listen to how it makes you feel. How do you feel when you hear this perfect octave? I don't know what your answer is. I imagine many of you will have many different answers to these questions I'm going to be asking today, and that's awesome. That's beautiful. I love it, right? But I just want you to and if closing your eyes helps you, that's fine. Or keep your eyes open. But either way, try to determine how you feel when you hear a perfect octave. Interesting. Okay. Try to, I don't know, if you can, how do you feel when you hear perfect unison? That's interesting. Because of the sounds of these two keyboards, when I hear that perfect unison, it just sounds like one note. I can't even really determine that there are two different notes being played. It almost feels like one of the notes kind of dominates the other, and I end up just hearing this as a single note when I play this. Isn't that interesting? Anyway, okay. So we've heard perfect unison. We've heard the perfect octave. And now we're going to discover some other intervals that are related to this chromatic scale that I showed you in the last video. So let's start with the interval that occurs when I play the C and then the note right above it, which is C sharp. Okay. Now check this out. I'll tell you what it's called in just a moment. Okay. Oh, there's so much to talk about right now. I get excited because there's so much to talk about. But check this out. I'm going to play C, and I'm going to play C sharp, and I'm going to play them at the same time. Again, close your eyes if you need to. You don't need to close your eyes, but how do you feel when I play this interval? I'm going to play it again. Okay. That's called a minor second. It's got some other names as well, but for now, I just want to call that a minor second. Okay, a minor second. I'm also going to play the interval that's formed when I play C and D. So the first thing I did was I played the interval formed by C and the note that was a half step above C, which is C sharp. Okay, and I just told you that's called a minor second. Okay, so what we're really doing is we're just going to move up the keyboard and we're going to play a number of intervals that are related to this chromatic scale that I showed you last time. Okay, so the first was the interval created by playing C and C sharp, and this is called a minor second. Whoa. The second interval is formed by playing C and D, right? Okay, and D, you can think of this as D as a half step above C sharp, or it's a whole step above C. At any rate, it's also the second note of that chromatic scale that's the easiest way to describe this. Okay, here's an interval formed by playing the root note. I haven't even told you that yet, but oftentimes we call this the root note. Okay, which is the first note of the chromatic scale that I showed you last time. So by playing the root note and the note right above it, which is C sharp, I get that minor second. Then if I play C and D, I get a major second. You know, that's a very different sound to me. That sounds very different to me than that minor second. Very interesting. Well, we're going to continue here, and we're going to play the interval formed by playing C and D sharp. That's actually called a minor third. I'm going to talk a little bit about why this one was called a minor second, a major second, and then a minor third. I'll talk about where those number with the second, the third, like where are those go? I'll talk about those in a moment. Okay, but for now, we got the minor second, C and C sharp. We got the major second, C and D. We got a minor third, C and D sharp. You know what's coming next? C and E. That's called a major third. I'm going to play that again. Okay, up next, C and F. A perfect fourth. One more time. Wow. Okay, and this next one, yeah, I guess for now we'll call it an augmented fourth. Okay, so here's a perfect fourth. And now we're going to play the interval between the root note and the, I guess you could call it a sharp 4 or an augmented 4. So let's see what this sounds like. Play that again. Augmented fourth. Or check this one out. A perfect fifth. I'm going to play C and G. A perfect fifth. Up next, C and G sharp. This is a minor sixth. Up next, C and A. This is a major sixth. Up next, C and, where are we? A sharp. I'll go ahead and call this an augmented sixth. C and B. This will be called a major seventh. And the last one we've already heard, this is C and C, which is an octave above it, and this is called a perfect octave. One more time. Isn't that interesting? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to play those intervals again, and I want you to hear the sound of these intervals. And what's going to happen is I'm going to actually end this video here soon, and then in the next video I'm going to talk more about where those names came from. Perfect unison, minor second, major second. Let's play them. Okay. Perfect unison. Minor second. Major second, minor third, perfect fourth, augmented fourth, perfect fifth, augmented fifth, major sixth, augmented sixth, major seventh, and a perfect octave. So I think what would be great is if you have access to a keyboard, that would be fantastic for you to just familiarize yourself with the sound of these intervals. Some people would refer to this as the color of the interval, okay? There are some people who hear intervals in music and they associate each of those intervals with a color. I forget exactly what this is called, and if you know, drop a comment. I forget what this is called, but for example, someone would hear a perfect fifth as blue, and then they would hear a perfect fourth as purple, and they would hear a major seventh as green. It's a very interesting comment. Anyway, I often refer to the color, the color of a chord or the color of an interval, and it's very interesting that there are people who literally associate intervals with colors, and it's just sort of part of their, I think it's part of their brain, I think it's part of their makeup, and the part of just the way they interpret sort of music. It's very fascinating. So anyway, if you have a keyboard and you can play some of these intervals, sit by yourself if you can, a pair of headphones, something like that, and just play these intervals and see if you can determine, which intervals you like, which intervals you maybe don't like. I hope you don't like any of them. I don't know. They're just different. But if you prefer certain intervals over others, if they make you feel differently, right? Does hearing a minor second make you feel differently than hearing a minor third? Maybe, maybe not. So explore that. Next time I'm going to come back at you, and what I'm going to explore next time are some of the alternate names that we have for some of these intervals that we just talked about today. And many of them, and in fact, I believe every single one of these has an alternate way of naming it. And it's related to sort of that concept of moving up the keyboard or moving down the keyboard, and it's similar to naming this C sharp or D flat, even though it's the same note. It's got two names. Well, some of these intervals have two or more names as well, and we're going to talk about that. So we'll talk about that next time, and hang in there. If you like this video, please hit like. If you want to see more, subscribe to the channel, and tell your friends if they're interested in learning a little bit more about music, and remember, the idea here is to have fun, right? This is the fundamental P, and the idea there is that we're having fun as we explore some of these concepts. So see you next time, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.